Bouncing ball to first. Bell will step on the bag. He'll throw wide of second. Run down. Now you get a chance to steal a run. Now the peg to the plate. Another pickle. Heredia between third and home. Still in it. Still in it. Still in it. And the catcher gets in the way.
Watching this game, you can probably tell that something exciting is going on. It may seem like just people running away from a ball, but if you understand the rules of baseball, then you understand that this is a unique play. You understand that this is a rundown, and that the player in white needs to arrive at one of the bases so he wouldn't be tagged out, while the players in red are trying to stop him. In the end, the red catcher interferes with the white player, and so the white team automatically gets a point they wouldn't have gotten otherwise. Knowing the rules changes how we can understand the game and how we participate in it, whether as viewers or even as players. This way of thinking that looked to understand the rules is called structuralism. Structuralism is a field of thought that emerged in the 19th century, and it became dominant in the middle of the previous century. It looked at every phenomena in the world, natural and cultural, and tried to understand what fundamental rules can explain it. Structuralism spread throughout many disciplines. So for example, in linguistics. The old approach to studying languages would look at the etymology of words and how their use and meaning changed throughout history. If we take the word fellow as an example, it would be studied from its origins in Old Norse and Germanic and its evolution into modern English. However, a structuralist approach to linguistics would look at how a sentence, the rules that organize a sentence. So for example, how in English the adjective always comes before the noun, while in Hebrew the noun always comes before the adjective, and in German the verb comes at the end of the sentence. Structuralism also appeared in anthropology. Anthropologists studied indigenous tribes in Brazil and Australia and uncovered that the rules of who one is allowed to marry within their tribe is not the result of some pre-modern fears, rather the result of complex rules that organize the tribe. For example, if this tribe is divided into two groups and each group is divided into 3 classes, one is only allowed to marry those who belong to the same class as them but are in a different group. These rules were simplified and abstracted to the point that they could be explained with mathematical equations. Structuralism also appeared in literature, in the study of structures that make up plot lines. So for example, structuralists learned that every Russian fairy tale has the same structure. It always begins with a hero setting out on a journey, encountering a villain who distracts them from that journey, then meeting a friend who redirects them until they arrive at their destination. From the 1950s until about the 1990s, structuralism spread throughout every discipline worldwide, and I'm sure that each of your disciplines has a period when it used structuralist methods. It also appeared in my field of research, architecture. Architects from the 60s onwards were interested in finding the rules that organize spatial phenomena. And I think that when I say rules of spatial phenomena, we naturally think of places where the presence of rules is obvious. We can easily identify that there's a specific distance between the symmetrical columns of the Parthenon in Athens, or that there are precise dimensions to the blocks in Barcelona, and in a typical suburb, there are consistent proportions between the street, the sidewalk, the front lawn, and the house. The order here is clear. However, these architects in the 60s were more interested in places like the Pueblos in southwestern America and the Casbahs in Algiers. These were places that developed organically and spontaneously in response to their inhabitants' changing needs, and not by an architect who decided on what these places would end up looking like. So they studied these buildings, but unlike in anthropology, where the purpose of studying these rules is just to understand them, and not to invent new societies based on them, it is inherent to the discipline of architecture to design new buildings. So they also they designed new buildings that were based on the rules that they learned. These buildings did not push for a specific form, and they did not try to copy the traditional buildings. Rather, they followed the rules and let the combination of those rules produce the outcome. These were rules such as the different ways to cluster buildings together, the different combinations of serial forms, the possibility for endless continuity and a flexibility that allowed for change and adaptation to different people and situations. My research studied how these structuralist theories appeared at the architecture faculty at the Technion. There are a few ways that structuralism appeared at the Technion, but there were two main uses. In the 60s, it involved math and natural forms, and in the 80s, it involved history and disciplinary forms. This structural architecture from the 60s was actually the largest internationally renowned output of architecture from the Technion ever. These architects studied natural forms. For example, they studied the rules of efficient space enclosure from beehives and bubbles. These resulted in many strange but prominent buildings across Israel, such as this hotel in Chatzeva, the synagogue in Bad Echad, the municipality building of Bat Yam, and the mechanical engineering labs at the Technion. In another example, architects studied the assemblies of crystals and how they how they organize complex forms, and then turned them into design methods. Others studied the mathematical forms of polyhedrons and turned them into pavilions and experimental projects. These architects had extensive knowledge of math and different scientists to support their work, and their work was published in both architectural and scientific journals and conferences. While courses about this kind of architecture, structural architecture, were still taking place at the Technion in the 80s, simultaneously another kind of structural architecture emerged. But this wasn't built, it only took place in the pedagogy of architecture, and it wasn't mathematics-focused, rather history-focused. The professor and architect Robert Oxman used structuralism in an attempt to understand what were the fundamental rules of the architectural discipline itself. He looked at building plans because plans are the architect's tool to show the organization of architecture. He looked at buildings that were built 400 years apart and showed that they actually have rules of organization in common. To him, such as the centralized building type. To him, this meant that if the same rules were being used throughout history, regardless of style, then they must be inherent to the architectural discipline itself. Oxman, together with others, developed design exercises for students. In these exercises, students would analyze existing built projects and then develop new designs that were based on the rules and elements that they extracted in their analysis. These were formal rules, such as the rotation and reflection of shapes, or the different ways to enclose a space with boundaries. An example of an exercise requested students to analyze this housing system that was built in Denmark. The students analyzed the building into its elements and then designed new designs that used the same elements and the same rules of combination. With these methods, new designs would always be grounded within an existing language of architecture. So structuralism in architecture was a way to look to existing solutions for architectural problems. It wasn't just a way to understand what solutions exist, but also a way to generate new designs that were grounded in what was intuitive to nature, to human lives, and to architecture. This is a very different approach than what was practiced before structuralism became prevalent. Back then, architecture was continuously reinvented and new designs were being sought after, while getting rid of what existed there before. In a way, structuralism offered a more sensitive and even humble alternative. But when I arrived at the Faculty of Architecture at the Technion 8 years ago, then no one spoke about structuralism. I learned about lots of other things. I learned about the history of modernism. I learned about social criticism. But structuralism I encountered only by chance through a school project. Somehow structuralism completely disappeared from the curriculum and from history. It's possible its disappearance has to do with the rise of criticism, just as structuralism was dying out. Today, architects face some of the most daunting challenges yet. By 2040, Israel will be the densest country in the world, and that is only if we survive the severe effects of climate change by then. There is also a rise in issues of identity and belonging, which have always interested architects. Instead of once again trying to reinvent solutions, this might be the good time to be a little bit more structuralist and to look to existing solutions, how others in history and in nature have already approached and tried to solve similar problems. With a structuralist approach, we can not only understand how others have solved these problems, but also generate a renewed world that is grounded in what we know can work. Thank you. I have questions.
Hi, thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. I'm coming from anthropology, so we have our structuralism, so it was very interesting to hear that. I wanted to ask you about nature. Is it the same nature you're using now as the nature your previous colleagues use? I mean, I think of anthropology in the 60s, the way they conceptualized nature and natural or universal structure was in a very specific way of what human shares in the world. Obviously, in the year past, it was severely criticized then. But what happens now with nature, and is it the same? Thanks.
Can I just ask, what do you mean, sorry, but nature, as people use nature before?
Yeah, I'm saying that people in the 60s might have a different concept of nature.
Of nature than what we do now?
Yeah.
Well, I guess I wouldn't know to say too much about how we conceptualize nature today. Trying to think, this research it's an historical research of what people did in the 60s and in the 80s. And at the time, the nature that they were looking for really was, well, I guess if they were looking at, traditional dwellings, then it was sort of natural understanding of how humans live. And that would, I'd have to think about that one. I don't know. Thank you.
Thanks, Chen, for the wonderful and well-presented presentation. I wanted to ask, how do you see this tradition at Technion today? You mentioned it kind of disappeared and you didn't see it in the Technion. If so, why do you think that is the case if all the kind of father figures of the architecture faculty were actually from the structuralist tradition?
Mm-hmm. Sorry, can you say that again?
So how do you see the structuralist tradition appearing today at the faculty or disappearing, and why?
There are certain characteristics of structuralism that are showing up again now at the faculty. I'm not sure if this is what you meant, but you see it a lot in student projects. Students are looking to design buildings that are flexible and that they're more based on systems and not on certain forms that they want to produce. But they don't talk about it as part of the structuralist traditions. It's more rooted in an attempt to sort of, in a current understanding of society and individualism, and allow for different situations for different people, because all of humans are very different and unique. But I think that if we think that we're inventing these solutions now, it's a misunderstanding of how these ideas developed. They were developed back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and people have already tried to invent some solutions like that, and we're missing out on some research that has already been done. I'm not trying to say that structuralism necessarily is something we need to go back to, but since some of its characteristics are already interesting people today, then it's worthwhile to check where these ideas originated from and how they developed.
Hi, I'm Yoni from the University of Haifa. A really beautiful presentation. Could you elaborate a bit more about how a structuralist approach would approach the problem of density in Israel? What would you look at and possible solutions?
Yes, absolutely. There's a general conception. Today, the main solution that we see being built for density is there's taller and taller towers being built, and they're repetitive and they appear everywhere. There's a general understanding in architecture that places like the Kasbahs in Al-Dir, I don't know if you remember the image of it, or places like this, really, that they are more dense than the towers if you consider distances between towers, and they offer more types of housing than the repetitive same apartments that don't really fit all the different kinds of families that there are, or different kind of living situations. So it's also more dense, and it has more opportunities.
Hi, thank you. Very interesting. I'm Omri from Ben Gurion University. I was wondering, two thoughts which are kind of the same, from the same idea. First is there any qualities of flexibility in structuralism in architecture? And if there are, can you elaborate a little bit on that? Because sometimes we can, I don't know, mix them up, like two parts of, like one is on one side and the other is on the other side. And another similar thought is, where is architecture, structuralism meets, where does it meet biomimicry? And is there any relevance to that?
Okay, I'll try to remember both questions. There's two answers to your first question. The flexibility appears in two different ways. The first is that if these, well, I'll go with the second one first. If there's an approach that tries to analyze buildings into their elements, then you can do it, for example, by taking a specific shape, and that's an element. But also a wall can be an element, a column can be an element. And within that, you can decide on a specific system that is your fixed system, and other things such as, like if your columns are fixed, then your walls can maybe be flexible. And that can allow for an existing built building to have within it a flexibility and can be changed just with a family's changing lives. But also, the whole idea of looking at a system means that, for example, the two forms can be attached in different ways. So maybe the building itself can't move, but it does create lots of different kinds of situations that you don't necessarily know what they're going to end up looking like, but you can attach another one of these shapes right on top of this one, or you can attach it in the front of it, and it still follows the same rules and it still looks the same, but it's a completely different kind of a backyard or a front lawn or a children's room or balcony. And biomimicry, I don't know enough about theories of biomimicry to say, but it definitely does look to appear like nature. But I wouldn't know what to say theoretically.
Last question.
Hi, I'm Dana from Hebrew University. Thank you for this beautiful talk, a beautiful presentation. What is the interplay between structuralism and aesthetics in the field of architecture? Is there room for both?
Well, I think part of what structuralism was trying to do was not have a specific image of what they wanted to end up looking like. It's very process-based and not image-based. So that means that they care a lot more about the formal configurations and how they play with them, and if they end up looking a little bit ugly, I think that was sort of almost part of the ideology in a way. So aesthetics in that sense has less of a significance as an ideology. But they do end up having a very specific, like you can recognize buildings that are structureless because you see these like lots of little small shapes that are joined together. But I don't think that they cared. I think they wanted not to care because they wanted the process to be an important thing. I think so.
Thank you very much, Cheyn.